Peter says, hey, they aren't drunk, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. And I said, yeah, the green turtle isn't even open yet. The coming of the Spirit into the world. I have a number of friends who take pains to point out each year something that is good for all of us to remember. And it's the difference between Memorial Day and Veterans Day. Right? The difference between Memorial Day and Veterans Day. Veterans Day is, of course, a day to honor those who have served in the military. Memorial Day is a day to remember those who have died. Those who have died in the service, some, those who have died having served, certainly, those who have died. The story in Acts is really a story of returning home. We were talking about that a little bit this morning. Returning to your roots, returning to the place you grew up. Maybe not literally grew up, because not all of these people that are in the story grew up in the city that they're in the story, which is Jerusalem. They didn't all grow up there, but that was their spiritual home. That was their spiritual center, the spiritual place that they came from. It was a spiritual place where their language was spoken. It was a spiritual place where their faith, their religion, their belief was taught and practiced. It was the spiritual place that was at the center of who they were, who they identified as out in the world. I don't know if we have a place like that. Maybe it's here for some people. Maybe it's somewhere else. But the common experience of everyone having gone out from their spiritual home, their spiritual center, and returning to that home is what's being described here. Returning to the place that they're from, in quotes, even if they're not actually from there. And the text clearly says, that a lot of them didn't even speak the language anymore. They probably could understand it. They could probably understand the language, but they didn't speak it anymore. It wasn't the language of where they were now from. Not their spiritual home, but their literal home. In another country. In another place. Around and among people who weren't their historic people. Who didn't believe the same things. Or practice the same things. They were returning home from being what the Gospel of Luke, in one famous story that you all know, calls a far country, or a distant country. It's the story of the prodigal son. That when he's as far away from home as he can get, he's in a far country. And these are all people who have gathered together. For the Feast of Pentecost, they probably stuck around after the Passover for the Feast of Pentecost, which is a lesser festival in the Jewish practice, but still a festival. They've stuck around at home. They've stuck around at their spiritual center because they probably miss it. They miss it so much. They miss it like that prodigal sitting in the pig pen with no friends except the pigs. They miss it like we miss it when we're disconnected from our home, from our center, from our base, whatever that is. We miss it like we miss a beloved relative, a beloved ancestor, a beloved parent, when they are no longer with us. We miss it like Memorial Day. We miss it like remembering all of the sacrifice sacrifices, all of the service that it took to allow us to be here. Most of it was not ours, right? Very little of it was ours, even if we did serve in a certain way. Most of it happened before we were born, before we got here. And so they've returned home. They've returned to that memorial place, that place that's in their hearts all the time, even if they don't get to live there. Even if they barely remember the language. You know, my mom spoke it at home, but we don't speak it in my home, so I don't really remember it. They came to that place. And suddenly, what burst into the middle of that home, familiar place was the Spirit of God, and it was weird, and it was loud, and there was fire going on, and there were sounds, and there were people who seemed so crazy and off-putting that it was like, oh, look at that guy there. He's had more than is good for him. You know, the reaction, the response, it says clearly in the story was, ooh. That was the reaction and the response. The kids are too cute. They're too cute to elicit that response, but I hope it was a little shocking to you when we opened the door and came running in. Into the middle of this sanctuary, it's a sanctuary. We're safe here. But it's also a place of beloved memory, of cherished memory. You know, I didn't ask the kids to, get up and dance on the altar. And you're like, good, right? Good. You better not. But I mean, that's, the Spirit. It was exciting and invigorating, but it was also kind of a violation. You know what I mean? It was a violation. It was a violation for those who had gathered to remember. You know, my dad's sitting here, when I think of all the years that I spent as an elementary school student. I grew up in Gettysburg, or outside of Gettysburg, and we would go to the cemetery on every Memorial Day and lay flags on the cemetery. And I'm pretty much open to anything, but I know how the people of Gettysburg and the people who come there to remember, I know how they would react in the midst of that service and ceremony with people in uniform and school children dressed to the nines and laying flags and laying wreaths and hearing solemn words and hearing old familiar words and remembering. I know how they would react. All of a sudden, a bunch of crazy people who seemed drunk came running into the middle of that, screaming and shouting about something. I know that it would be a violation, right? Of course it would. Home, memory, the Spirit that our ancestors had, the service, the sacrifice that they did. All of these things were on the minds of those people on that day. I'm sure that they were, as they gathered there in their spiritual home. And then these interlopers, these outsiders, these strangers came running into the middle of it. And they were babbling, and they were on fire. Literally on fire. I would have been so mad. I bet they were so mad. But then suddenly they realized that they could understand what was being said. That it was being spoken to them. It was being spoken to them by those who were from home. By those for whom this was also spiritual home. But it was being spoken to them not in the home language. Not in the language that they had grown up with, the language that Mom spoke and that I struggle to remember. It was being spoken to them in the new language. The language that they had learned. The language of their new country. The language that they had taken on in order to move there, in order to live there. The language of the everyday people that they were surrounded with, that they didn't understand not in the home language, but in the new language, the adopted language, the language of the place that they lived now. And so they could understand it. They could understand it, not in that spiritual, home-centered, return, beloved memory kind of way. They could understand it in that ordinary, everyday business transaction. I have to use this language to live my life kind of way. The Spirit was being poured out on them. And we know that, and we remember that, and we treasure and we cherish that. But we have to remember that the Spirit was not just being poured out into church. The Spirit was not just being poured out into ceremonies of beloved memory. The Spirit was not just being poured out through hymns or through sermons or through communion rituals. The Spirit was being poured out on their desk at work. The Spirit was being poured out on the stuff of everyday life that they slogged through. The Spirit was being poured out on the places and the people that they weren't really sure about yet, that they had returned to their home to get away from or get a break from. The Spirit was being poured out into the world, the real world, not the treasured world of beloved memory, not the sainted artifact world of the past, but the today world, the now world, the world that they live in. And it's the world that we live in too. And the thing that binds us all together, even though we don't maybe share the same spiritual home, or the same beloved memories, or the same original language, the thing that binds us all together is that we have that in us. We have that memory, we have that witness, we have that past service that has built our lives and brought us to the place that we are now, the announcement of Pentecost, the announcement with fire and screaming and jumping up and down, is that same Spirit that built you and brought you to where you are now wants to saturate, to infuse, to flow out into every single part of your life. Every single part of it. We are the ones who too often, I'm not talking about us as individuals, but we in the church are the ones who too often are guilty of holding the Spirit in here and then going out there and saying, well, that's church stuff. I go back to church to do that. Judy told a great story this morning about people holding hands and praying, like out in the world, and scared. The Spirit wants to infuse every part of your life. The secular part as well as the sacred part. The profane part as well as the holy part. The part that you don't let everybody see, and the part that you do. The Spirit is infusing all of that. And it's doing it through the language that you can understand. The language that they can understand. The language that God speaks. Which is a language of the head, the heart, the Spirit. May we continue to be open to being vessels of that Spirit. And may we strive in whatever way we can to share that connecting Spirit. That Spirit of joy and jumping up and down. That Spirit of remembering. That Spirit of treasuring. That Spirit of action in every place that we are. May the peace of God, which passes all understanding, guard your hearts and your minds. In Christ Jesus our Lord.